The European Union emerged from the ashes of World War II, born out of a determination to prevent another devastating conflict on the continent. The war had left Europe economically devastated and politically fragmented, with millions dead and entire cities reduced to rubble. In this context, visionary leaders began to conceive of a new form of European cooperation that would make war between traditional enemies not just unthinkable, but materially impossible. The intellectual foundations were laid by figures like Jean Monnet, often called the father of Europe, who believed that peace could only be secured through economic integration. His approach was pragmatic. Rather than attempting grand political unity immediately, Europe should begin with concrete steps in specific sectors. This functionalist approach would create interdependencies that would gradually make conflict impossible and cooperation inevitable. The first concrete step came with the Schuman Declaration of May 9, 1950, delivered by French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman. Drafted by Monnet, the declaration proposed placing French and German coal and steel production under a common high authority, open to participation by other European countries. This was revolutionary. These were the raw materials of war, and by pooling them under supranational control, France and Germany would make future conflict between them impossible. The European Coal and Steel Community was established in 1951 with 6 founding members: France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The ECSC created the first supranational European institution with a high authority that had real power to make binding decisions. This marked the beginning of European integration as we know it today. Building on this success, the same 6 countries signed the Treaties of Rome in 1957, establishing the European Economic Community and the European Atomic Energy Community. The EEC aimed to create a common market with free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. The treaty outlined a gradual process of integration, with a customs union as the first step toward an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. The EEC's early years were marked by significant economic integration and institutional development. The customs union was completed ahead of schedule in 1968, eliminating tariffs between member states and establishing a common external tariff. This created a single market of 180 million people, which became a powerful engine for economic growth. However, political integration proved more challenging. The empty chair crisis of 1965–1966 highlighted tensions between supranational and intergovernmental approaches to European integration. French President Charles de Gaulle, opposed to the increasing power of European institutions, withdrew France from council meetings for 7 months. The crisis was resolved with the Luxembourg Compromise, which established that decisions would be taken by unanimity when vital national interests were at stake, effectively giving each member state a veto. The 1970s brought the first enlargement, with the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Denmark joining in 1973. Britain's accession was particularly significant, as it brought in Europe's second-largest economy and a country with strong global connections. However, Britain's relationship with the EEC remained ambivalent from the start, with the Labour government holding a referendum in 1975 on whether to remain in the community. The yes vote won decisively with 67% support. During this period, European integration deepened in several areas. The European monetary system was established in 1979 to create a zone of monetary stability, with the exchange rate mechanism linking member currencies. The European Parliament gained its first directly elected members in 1979, giving European integration a democratic dimension. The early 1980s, however, saw European integration stagnate amid economic recession and political disagreements. The period was characterized by Eurosclerosis, institutional deadlock, and inability to make progress on major initiatives. Budget disputes, particularly over Britain's contributions, dominated European Council meetings. The mid-1980s marked a turning point with the adoption of the Single European Act in 1986. This was the first major revision of the founding treaties and set the goal of completing the internal market by 1992. The CE introduced qualified majority voting for single market legislation, reducing the ability of individual states to block progress. Jacques Delors, who became Commission President in 1985, provided dynamic leadership during this period. Under his guidance, the Commission produced the Cecchini Report, which demonstrated the enormous economic benefits of completing the single market. The 1992 project became a rallying cry for renewed European integration. The late 1980s also saw the second enlargement, with Greece joining in 1981, followed by Spain and Portugal in 1986. These southern enlargements brought in countries that had recently transitioned from dictatorship to democracy, reinforcing the EU's role in promoting democratic values. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe created new opportunities and challenges for European integration. German reunification in 1990 was achieved within the European framework, demonstrating the community's ability to adapt to historical change. The Treaty on European Union, signed in Maastricht in 1992, marked the most ambitious step in European integration since the Treaty of Rome. It created the European Union as an umbrella organization encompassing the existing European communities plus new areas of cooperation in foreign policy and justice and home affairs. The treaty established the famous three-pillar structure with the European community as the supranational first pillar, and intergovernmental cooperation in the other two pillars. Most significantly, Maastricht set out a detailed plan for economic and monetary union, including the creation of a single currency. The treaty established strict convergence criteria for countries wishing to adopt the euro, covering inflation, government deficits, public debt, exchange rate stability, and long-term interest rates. The treaty also introduced European citizenship, giving EU nationals rights to move and reside freely within the Union, vote in European Parliament and local elections in their country of residence, and receive diplomatic protection from any EU member state. These provisions strengthened the connection between the EU and its citizens. However, the ratification of Maastricht proved difficult. The Danish referendum initially rejected the treaty in June 1992, causing a European crisis. The French referendum passed by the narrowest of margins. These results revealed growing public skepticism about European integration and the need for greater democratic legitimacy. The launch of the euro on January 1, 1999, was the most visible symbol of European integration since the creation of the EEC. 11 countries initially adopted the common currency, creating the world's second-largest currency zone. The European Central Bank, established in Frankfurt, became responsible for monetary policy for the Eurozone. The early years of the euro were challenging, with the currency initially falling against the dollar. However, it gradually gained credibility and by the mid-2000s had become a genuine alternative to the dollar as a reserve currency. The most significant development of this period was the Eastern enlargement of 2004 to 2007, which brought in 10 new members: Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, and Cyprus, followed by Bulgaria and Romania in 2007. This enlargement doubled the EU's membership and represented the historic reunification of Europe after the Cold War division. The Eastern enlargement required extensive preparation, with candidate countries required to adopt the entire body of EU law before membership. This process drove democratic and economic reforms across Eastern Europe and helped consolidate the transition from communism. However, enlargement also created new challenges. The EU to 15 had been relatively homogeneous in terms of economic development and political culture. The new members brought much greater diversity with lower income levels and different historical experiences. This complicated decision-making and raised questions about the EU's future direction. The early 2000s saw an ambitious attempt to provide the EU with a constitutional foundation. A convention on the future of Europe, chaired by former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, drafted a constitutional treaty that would have replaced all existing treaties with a single document. The constitutional treaty was signed in 2004, but faced severe difficulties during ratification. French and Dutch voters rejected it in referendums in 2005, throwing the EU into its deepest crisis since the empty chair crisis of the 1960s. The no votes reflected concerns about globalization, Turkish membership, and the perceived democratic deficit in EU institutions. After a reflection period, European leaders eventually agreed on the Lisbon Treaty in 2007, which salvaged most of the constitutional treaty's substance while abandoning its constitutional form. The Lisbon Treaty created the position of President of the European Council, strengthened the role of the European Parliament, and gave the EU a single legal personality. However, ratification of Lisbon also proved difficult, with Irish voters initially rejecting it in 2008 before approving it in a second referendum in 2009. The treaty finally entered into force on December 1, 2009, providing the EU with its current institutional structure. The global financial crisis of 2008 exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Eurozone's design. While the EU had created a monetary union, it lacked the fiscal integration and economic governance mechanisms necessary to manage asymmetric shocks. The crisis began with Greece's revelation that its budget deficit was much higher than previously reported, leading to a sovereign debt crisis that threatened the entire Eurozone. The EU's response evolved gradually from ad hoc crisis management to systematic reform of economic governance. The European Financial Stability Facility and later the European Stability Mechanism were created to provide financial assistance to countries in difficulty. The European Central Bank, under Mario Draghi's leadership, played a crucial stabilizing role, particularly after his famous promise in 2012 to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. The crisis led to significant institutional innovations, including the European Semester for Economic Policy Coordination, the Fiscal Compact requiring balanced budgets, and banking union with common supervision and resolution mechanisms. These reforms represented a significant step toward deeper integration, though they remained incomplete. However, the crisis also created political tensions, with creditor countries insisting on austerity measures and debtor countries experiencing severe economic hardship. The handling of the Greek crisis in particular raised questions about solidarity and democratic accountability within the EU. The Brexit referendum of June 23, 2016, delivered the most serious shock to European integration since its inception. The UK's decision to leave the EU by 52% to 48% challenged the assumption that European integration was irreversible and gave momentum to Eurosceptic movements across the continent. The Brexit process proved extraordinarily complex, taking over 3 years of negotiations before the UK finally left the EU on January 31, 2020. The withdrawal negotiations, led by Michel Barnier for the EU, demonstrated both the complexity of disentangling after decades of integration and the EU's unity in the face of an existential challenge. Brexit coincided with the rise of populist movements across Europe, many of which were highly critical of EU integration. Parties like the Alternative for Germany, Italy's Lega, and France's National Rally gained significant support by opposing immigration, globalization, and European integration. The migrant crisis of 2015-2016, which saw over 1 million asylum seekers enter Europe, provided additional fuel for these movements. The EU faced other challenges during this period, including deteriorating relations with Russia following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, concerns about democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland, and the growing assertiveness of China. The election of Donald Trump as U.S. President in 2016 also raised questions about the transatlantic relationship that had underpinned European integration. The COVID-19 pandemic represented the most serious crisis the EU had faced since its creation. Initial responses were uncoordinated, with member states closing borders and restricting exports of medical equipment. However, the EU gradually developed a more coordinated approach, particularly in vaccine procurement and economic recovery. The EU's response to the economic impact of COVID-19 marked a watershed moment. The Next Generation EU Recovery Package, worth €750 billion, included for the first time significant EU borrowing backed by the common budget. This represented a major step toward fiscal integration and demonstrated solidarity between member states. The pandemic also accelerated discussions about European strategic autonomy, particularly in healthcare, technology, and supply chains. The EU launched initiatives to reduce dependence on third countries in critical areas and strengthen its industrial base. After more than 7 decades of integration, the European Union has become a unique form of political organization, more than an international organization but less than a federal state. It has succeeded in its primary goal of securing peace in Europe, while creating the world's largest single market and promoting democratic values and human rights. Today's EU faces multiple challenges: maintaining unity amid growing diversity, addressing democratic deficits while managing complex interdependencies, responding to global challenges like climate change and technological disruption, and defining its role in an increasingly multipolar world. The Conference on the Future of Europe, launched in 2021, represents the latest attempt to adapt European integration to 21st century realities. The history of European integration demonstrates both the power of the European idea and the persistent tension between national sovereignty and supranational governance. As the EU continues to evolve, it must balance the need for deeper integration to address global challenges with respect for democratic legitimacy and national identities. The ultimate success of the European project will depend on its ability to maintain this delicate balance while continuing to deliver peace, prosperity, and security for its citizens. The EU's journey from the coal and steel community of 6 nations to today's Union of 27 countries represents one of the most remarkable political achievements of the modern era. Despite periodic crises and setbacks, European integration has shown remarkable resilience and adaptability. As it faces the challenges of the 21st century, the EU continues to evolve, guided by the vision of its founders but adapted to contemporary realities.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more engaging historical content.